Welcome to week 3 of Art with Mr. Orlando. This week we will be exploring two elements of art. We'll be exploring form and space. For the principle of design, we'll be exploring contrast. Come join me at the teaching table and we'll get right to work. So far, the elements of art, we have done line, shape, and value. The next one we're going to explore is form. And form primarily references a three-dimensional object. It is either real or implied. Real would be something like this, it's this camera sculpture that I created. And you'll see that it is three-dimensional. It has a width, a height, and a depth. And so it's kind of in the real world, it's three-dimensional. Now we can also reference a three-dimensional object. So a good example might be, I don't know, let's say I was actually going to try and reference this object. Let's take a really quick stab at this. And what I'm trying to do is just to kind of create that sense that it has kind of a three-dimensional, that it could actually exist in a three-dimensional space. So I'm going to take another little look at this. I'm not doing the best job, but you'll at least get a sense of what I'm talking about, which is that it has width, height, and depth. So this is kind of the, we call it like, it's like the illusion of a three-dimensional space. And artists will oftentimes use shading. So if there was a sun over here, I might shade one side. I might even create a shadow. And I think I put together what I think is a really good, I think there's a really good video that I put in the attachments for you that really kind of help as far as showing you how to create shading just from shapes. So this will be the highest lit. This will also be, let's see, I'm going to create a little bit more. So this is just a really quick kind of example of what I'm trying to get to, which is some three-dimensional. And by shading in, I can create the illusion of a three-dimensional space. So let's see. With form, we can reference it. It's implied. So if we take a square and turn it into a box, we've gone from a shape to a form. If we took a piece of paper and folded it up into a piece of origami, it would have 3 dimensions, thus it would become a three-dimensional space. And artists oftentimes use shading to try and create try to create the illusion of three-dimensional space. Next in the element of art is space. Now with space, we refers to the actual space on the piece, the illusion of space or depth, and positive and negative areas of interest within the piece. So if we were to imagine that this was a canvas, this would have a physical space of a width and a height. It's also a certain size, so it has a certain amount of physical surface space. A sculpture has a physical space, a three-dimensional object, it has height, width, and depth. And there's a physical space, and there's also like a contextual reference for space. In other words, this looks like a small piece because it has a reference of the real world. So we talked about the physical space, which is kind of like that size of space. The other type of space is what we think of as the reference of distance or space. Here you see an image or a drawing that I did that has multiple shapes, and the shapes get smaller as they go into the background. The river looks like it gets smaller, which creates the illusion of distance. And so this is another way of referencing using space as an element of art. Remember we talked about the physical space of like the canvas. Another way that artists use space is to create an area of interest. So here what you're seeing is a work by an artist named Robert Gutierrez, and you see that he is creating an area of interest which takes up a pretty large portion of this canvas. So he's using a lot of the space to kind of create the area of interest. Let's juxtapose that to another piece by the same artist. And here you see that he's approaching it very differently. He's using a very small amount of space, and it's the amount of space that's not in the center, it's way down at the bottom. And he's using a lot of negative space or background space. So graphic designers will oftentimes call this white space, but as an element of art, we think of the area of interest as the positive space and the background as the negative space. The next use of space I'd like to introduce you to is the use of the environment as a space for your work. Here's a piece by a couple named the Christos, and this is an environmental installation where they have installed a curtain into in Colorado, and you see how the environment is an important aspect of the piece. I actually think the environment is an element of the work, and that the work is dependent upon this element of the environment. So that would be a use of the environmental space. Another artist who uses an environmental space is an artist named Andy Goldsworthy. And Andy Goldsworthy will oftentimes go out into the environment and then create these objects and then photograph them. And so I think that if you took this object and you lifted it up and you put it into a museum, it would have a very different feel than it has in this kind of in this environment. And so he's using the space of the environment as an important element in the artwork. I think in this context, the work looks a lot more fragile than I think it would look in a museum. Because here we have this idea of the environment and the rushing water, possibly even pulling bits of these objects away. So he's using the environmental space. If you wanted to do the challenge this week of going out and creating something in the environment and photographing it, that would be cool. Okay, now that we're done with the element of art, we used form, added form and space, we're going to move over to the principle of design that we've been working on. And this week what we're going to work on is the principle of design contrast. Now contrast refers to the arrangement of different elements to create visual interest. Differences can be opposites, such as light and dark, or large and small, or you can also have contrast without it being an opposite, such as a square and a triangle, which are different, but they're not opposites of each other. The difference can also be an anomaly, which is which is something that kind of stands out. In this sense, you've got a duck, 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 goose, duck, duck. Okay, so it's something that that stands out. Let's go ahead and play around with this when it comes to contrast. I'm going to put down this sheet. This will be my space for my work. And the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to bring in a bunch of different rocks. Now these are all different rocks, but they're similar in the sense that they're all kind of gray. There's not a major difference. You might be able to see a little bit of a difference there, right? So in this sense, a lot of rocks, but you know what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a contrast in the arrangement of them, right? So I have a grouping here, and then I have one all by itself, right? In this way, I've used the space to create a contrast between grouped and ungrouped. And so that would be the contrast of basically content or arrangement. Here's an example of sticks where I did the same thing, okay? Where you have one stick over here and a gathering of sticks. And your attention is drawn towards the contrast between the stick that stands alone and the stick that stands in a group. Here, if I take this rock and just take a much larger rock, and I'm working kind of with proportion or kind of size difference. There's a difference between large and small, grouping and small. If I place it this way, I'm really drawing attention to kind of that difference, right? And the difference should take me to the one that kind of stands out, which is that anomaly, okay? That one that stands out. Here's another example. This one is an example of sticks that I put together, and then there's a little piece of rope, right? So the rope should be kind of what stands out. Now, sometimes there's another area of interest. You notice how I turned that over? And I turned it over because for me, with it here, it looked almost too dynamic. It drew so much attention here that it felt like it was taking away from this focus. So I turned it around. I'm still working with contrast because I want the viewer's eye to go here. And I could play around with it. And I could make it even more contrasting by lifting it. Could also be a completely different color. Okay, so that's the principle of design contrast, where we have the arrangement of different elements. But again, it's the arrangement to create something that's visually interesting. So that's what I'll put down next here. Well, that's it for this week. We looked at the elements of art, form, and space. We also looked at the principle of design contrast. And as you can see, we've almost filled out all of the elements of art on our worksheet. Last week I had you look at a couple of artists. I had you look at Moreau and Rothko and answer some questions. This week I'm not going to ask you to watch a film on an artist. Instead, I'd like you to watch a technical film on how to turn a shape into a form. And it's just a pencil drawing class, but your studio challenge this week is to set 30 minutes aside in order to turn a shape into a form. I hope you have a good week. I hope your families are all safe, and I look forward to the time when we can all be in class together making art. Have a good week. Bye-bye.